everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is former Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. Secretary, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me on.
We are talking tariffs today, and I really think that you could provide a unique perspective here, considering you served as President Trump's Commerce Secretary in his previous administration. There were tariffs in that first term, but not nearly as sweeping as we see present day. So to start off the conversation, I would love if you could give your assessment of current Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. How do you think he's doing?
Well, I think he's doing fine. Howard is not historically a trade expert, but he's a very good businessman. He's a very quick learner, and he's working very, very hard at implementing a much more comprehensive program than we had in the first term. Because what's happened, President Trump is now much stronger than he had been in the first term. He controls the Republican Party, pretty much controls the Congress, even though the majorities are small. So between those facts and the fact that we won the court battles in the first administration about how we could do the tariffs, he now is using them much more broadly, much more comprehensively, and as a result, there's even more tariff activity than we had in the first term. So Howard's had a lot to catch up with.
There's more tariff activity, as you said, but Secretary Lutnick is getting hit for his messaging. Even Steve Bannon said that he's close to being an unmitigated disaster, and there is online speculation that should Lutnick leave the administration, markets would rally. What's your reaction to that?
Well, because they're moving so quickly, naturally there are some changes that they have to make as they go along, and that has that in the scope of it has people concerned because they don't see where is the end. Whereas last time we were fairly clearly defined. One would be steel, one would be aluminum, one would be refrigerators, one would be this. So it was a much narrower definition. It was clear where we were heading. And so it was a different program. Here, it's a whole lot of products to a whole lot of countries with a whole lot of different tariff levels. So naturally, in the beginning, that makes people a little confused. And I think the real thing they're worried about is what is the end game? Because these levels are also higher tariff levels than we were doing. We didn't have anything around 40, 50, 80, 100, 150%. So people are worried, is this going to be a forever escalating thing? And when you think about it, businesses can adapt to good news, they can adapt to bad news. What they have trouble adapting to is uncertainty. And now there's, for the moment, quite a bit of uncertainty. But I think once the president makes a deal with the first couple of large countries, and whether that's Vietnam or it's Japan or whoever it is, I think that will start to give people clarity. They will see there is an end to things. And I think then the markets will settle down.
You're a lifelong businessman. Are you one of those people who are worried? I mean, when you're looking at this, what do you think the end game is?
Well, I think it's clear the end game has multiple dimensions to it. One part of the end game, he definitely wants to reduce our trade deficit and reduce it quite materially. Number two, he is particularly interested in toning down the Chinese exports to us. Number three, so those are the big tariff things. However, he's also got some other objectives. these numbers are so big that they also are generating meaningful revenues to the US government that can be used to offset tax cuts and other things that the president wants to undertake. We didn't have that as a big objective last time. And then finally, he's also broadening it to deal with non-trade, non-cash diplomatic objectives like controlling fentanyl, like border security, like making larger contributions to NATO. So part of the reason people are feeling a bit uncertain is they see that he has multiple objectives. But there's nothing that will stop him from accomplishing all of those objectives. It's just he's throwing a lot at people all at one time. And I think that's good because he doesn't have that much time to make these things happen. So he might as well really launch a big, broad offensive.
Secretary, I would love to turn to semiconductors because that's where we saw a lot of that mixed messaging, especially over the weekend. The Trump administration said that they are conducting a Section 232 investigation into the import of semiconductors, and this is largely viewed as a harbinger to implement tariffs. I'm curious how you think the Trump administration is doing vis-a-vis semiconductors and tariffs.
Well, 232 is the basic legislation, Section 232 is the basic legislation that we used in the Trump's first administration. So that ground is very well trodden. It's been tested all the way up to the Supreme Court. So there's one good thing about it is we know that it works, and we know that it will be upheld on appeal. What's bad about it is it slows things down a bit because you have to prepare and research a very detailed report. You have to get the written concurrence of the Secretary of Defense. You have to have public hearings. You have a whole lot of steps you need to go through. So it's better in the sense that it's more bulletproof. It's worse in the sense that it takes a bit longer to complete. But as to whether we need a, a program for semiconductors, I think we clearly do. You may remember I was the big proponent of the CHIPS Act in the first administration. And while it did get passed and it's finally getting to be implemented, even that will not make us self-sufficient in semiconductors. We still will be importing a majority of the semiconductors that we consume. And we are, in fact, the world's largest consumer of semiconductors. So it is important to put up a tariff wall so that there's further assurance to people building semiconductor fabrication in the US that they will have a market and they will have a market that's not interfered with by products subsidized from other countries.
Before we move on there, I do want to get your take on what you would say to Secretary Lutnick about the Section 232, because you gave a pros and cons list. He has 9 months to complete the investigation, but he indicated that he will implement tariffs on semis in 1 to 2 months. What's your advice to him when it comes to this Section 232?
Well, clearly, anytime a president asks for something to be investigated, he has a target that the end result of the investigation will be a recommended action. Otherwise, he wouldn't bother to request the investigation to be done. So that's pretty logical. As to Secretary Lutnick, as I've said, I think we need to become more self-sufficient in semiconductors. I think what's important, though, is whatever level of tariff they aim to put on, there perhaps should be a graduated path to it, because it takes 2 to 3 years to build a semiconductor facility and to train the workers to do it. It's very, very technical work, very precise work, because remember, you're dealing with very, very small things, couple of nanometers in dimension, and it takes 3 nanometers to make one human hair in size. So you're dealing with really minute things, and you got to get it exactly right. So I think a phasing in of it in some way would make sense, because if you put a giant tariff on semiconductors right now, it won't stop the imports, because we do not have the capacity to make enough semiconductors. So all it will do is raise the cost of semiconductors. And therefore, I would recommend that they consider a ramp up over a couple of year time period.
To that point, you can't exactly snap your fingers and make a semiconductor factory in the United States. As you said, it takes about 2 to 3 years. So, do you think that these tariffs are premature? Would it make more sense for the tariffs to wait while we beef up domestic manufacturing?
No, I don't think they're premature in the sense that um, we do need to send a very clear message that they're going to be very big tariffs on them from countries. We need to give businesses who are considering putting in a fabricating plant assurance that this is real, that there really be tariffs. And remember, a fab plant is billions of dollars. These are very, very expensive things to build, because you need to make them pretty large scale. They have to be extremely clean. There are a whole lot of requirements that are much more precise than, let's say, building an automotive factory or something like that. So I don't think it's premature, especially because if you go through the list of the president's several objectives, one of them is raising revenues. And so semiconductor tariffs are certainly one way to raise revenue.
How, let's say you were Commerce Secretary right now, how exactly would you implement the semiconductor tariffs? Because you said you would do it in a more phased approach. What would that look like under Commerce Secretary Ross?
Well, what will be important will be, we probably will end up with different tariffs on the same product depending on the country it comes from. And if we end up that way, then we will also need to work out with the lower tariff countries uh, a situation where they won't accept semiconductors to come in from, say, China on a transshipment basis and benefit from the lower tariff of that other country. So it's going to be both sides of our supplier countries that we need to deal with. And that's a complication. With the semiconductors also are not a homogeneous entity. The size of the semiconductor in general, the smaller the size, the more powerful and the more useful. So the commodity type ones, the very large ones, are not necessarily of military significance, but are of commercial significance. Typical automobile has between 400 and 500 semiconductors in it, most of which are fairly commodity type. So there's also a difference, at least in my personal view, of the national security implications, depending on whether it's a very high-tech one or a very low-tech. So I would hope they give attention to not just the mass fact of semiconductors, but also to which size, which quality, which power they're dealing with, and perhaps treat them differently.
I would love to pick your brain on the H20 chips because AI chip maker Nvidia said they will suffer a $5.5 billion blow after the Trump administration put new restrictions on selling H20 chips to China. And do you see President Trump's about face when it comes to new restrictions on the H20 chips, which were originally made to adhere with U.S. export restrictions as a response to China blocking rare earth shipments?
Well, that's a whole complicated issue. I think the idea of China making a strenuous response should not surprise anyone. China is very dependent on exports, and the trade war, especially from their point of view, is quite complicated in that their economy is only 2/3 the size of ours. So that means $1 of pain that we inflict on their exports has 1.5 times the impact of a power of a pain that they inflict on us. Second, they export to us so much more than we do to them that pretty soon they run out of products to put tariffs on long before we would. So the strategies for China are very complex. And I was pleased to see, and I think it was constructive, that the Chinese publicly indicated that they're open to negotiating the tariff situation. And they even appointed a special, very senior person to be their point person. And they asked for President Trump to do the same thing. And the only quid pro quo they sought was to be treated with a little more respect and not have all the slamming that many of the cabinet officials have been doing of China. So I thought that was a good conciliatory move on their part, and one that hopefully will lead to negotiations. The other part of negotiations, though, is this. During Trump's first administration, we made a fairly extensive phase one deal with China, but they never lived up to it. So one of the key things that we ought to focus on this time is enforcement. If we do make a deal with China and they don't live up to it, what are we going to do to enforce it? How will we, in effect, punish them if they don't live up to the deal this time? And that's a complicated thing to do. But I think, given our history with them, it's a very important component. If you don't have an ability to enforce an agreement, what is it really worth?
President Trump said that talks between the United States and China are underway. He expects more talks to come, and he does predict that we will find a deal with China. In President Trump's first term as Commerce Secretary, you traveled to Beijing for trade talks with China. If you could impart any advice to the Trump administration and Commerce Secretary Lutnick in particular when it comes to dealing with China, speaking with them, and negotiating with them, what would that advice be?
Well, the main thing would be to recognize that we will have to make some sort of concessions to them in order to get concessions from them. And I don't mean just in terms of tariff, because the Chinese also have put up a lot of non-tariff trade barriers, uh, limitations on products that are not science-based at all, but are really just designed to prevent us from selling those products to them. You have to factor in the non-tariff trade barriers as well. We have very few non-tariff trade barriers, so there isn't much to worry about for the Chinese from us, but we have a lot to worry about from the Chinese side.
You've seen President Trump do his deal making. You've been in the room where it happens, so to speak. When you see President Trump now focusing on semiconductors, do you think he's using that as a chip, no pun intended, to get China to the negotiating table?
Well, every trade discussion ends up being a negotiation, and that's not only appropriate, it's inevitable, because trade is one of the most complicated economic phenomena a country has to deal with, because there are so many different geographies, there are so many different products. Every situation is a little bit different. Everybody's coming at it from a little different angle. So it President Trump learned a lot about it during his first administration, because we had extensive negotiations, not just with China, but with lots of other folks as well. And he also, very importantly, has become acquainted with the Chinese leadership. Prior to the administration, he had never dealt with the Chinese governmental leadership, so he didn't really have a clear idea what it would be like to deal with them. Now he's dealt with them quite a bit, both in terms of trade and in terms of all sorts of other policies. So I think he's better positioned to understand how to get a deal done.
I can only imagine how interesting of a seat you must be in right now, seeing all of this tariff talk and knowing that you were in that seat in Secretary Lutnick's position just a couple of years ago. If you were thrown back in as Commerce Secretary now, what would you do immediately? A, and B, seeing all the market volatility when it comes to these tariffs, does that concern you at all?
The objectives now, as I said, are more all-encompassing than what we had. So that means the negotiations will also be more complicated. For example, last time we weren't tying defense spending by target countries as a particular part of tariff negotiations. President has made clear that with the European countries, he wants them to step up the percent of GDP that they use for defense, and he's prepared to use trade tariffs as a weapon for doing that. So that adds another whole set of dimensions, because how do you balance how much benefit you get from the trade part as opposed to how much benefit you get from the non-trade part, like defense spending?
And my second part of the question was, are you concerned about the market volatility that we're seeing since the tariff plan was rolled out?
The reason for the market volatility has been A, the inherent uncertainty of the process. B, people were surprised with the extent of the initial batch. They were surprised at the rates, the tariff rates, some of which were quite high by historical standards, and they were surprised at how extensive it was. You saw some of the jokes about there were tariffs put in on a little island that doesn't have any people. It just has some animals on it. So they were maybe overly comprehensive.
Secretary, my final question to you is tariff talks have been ongoing now, and they have been the top headlines for months. Do you think anything is missing from the national and international dialogue when it comes to President Trump's tariff plan?
Well, I think you have to take Trump's economic policies as an overall entity, and there's a very important offset to the impact of tariffs, and that's his tax bill. The tax bill would not only make permanent the corporate and individual rate reductions that were put in during the first term, but they also would make Social Security payments tax-free. They would make overtime payments tax-free, whole bunch of things. Now, those two items are very powerful economic stimulators because people on Social Security have a very high propensity to consume. So the extra money that you give a retiree pretty much will get spent very, very quickly and therefore will be stimulatory to the economy. Making overtime tax-free would also have that benefit, but it would have another further benefit, which is simply stepping up industrial production and making it more efficient because your variable costs are not nearly as extensive as the fixed costs.
Secretary Wilbur Ross, I appreciate your time today. I appreciate the in-depth conversation. You are welcome back anytime. Thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed chatting with you. You had some very good questions. It'll be great to see how they're finally answered.